This week on the Sports Initiative podcast, I sit down with PhD student Megan Hill. Studying out of the University of Bath, she discusses her research into growth and maturation, biobanding and how it can have an effect on elite sporting environments, as well as best practice in the support of young athletes going through growth. I hope you enjoy. So first of all, Megan, appreciate you doing this. How are things? How's everything going? I'm guessing, how was it handing in your work?
Yeah, it was good. It was quite anticlimactic handing in lockdown and doing it from home rather than having the printed version to hand in. But yeah, it felt good. And I've had a few weeks off to sleep in lockdown, which has been nice. But yeah, and thanks for having me.
No problem. So I guess for people that don't know you or don't know your background, you just want to explain kind of your background and then how you've got into your thesis area and research area, etc.
Yeah, so I've always been involved in sport as a kid, and I used to be quite a competitive swimmer. But I was always the smallest one on poolside, always the littlest one. And so I kind of had an understanding from like my coaches and my parents always saying like, be patient, you know, things will come with time. So I went to university to do human biology at Loughborough, again, quite a sporty uni, did quite a lot of sports science-based modules. And then I came to do my master's at the University of Bath under Dr. Sean Cummings, and his research area is growth and maturation in like sport in general. And my interest came from like my days in swimming where I'd always been the littlest on poolside and found it quite hard to compete. And then I became a swimming coach and kind of saw that all the way through the ages. And so I kind of just had a passion for kind of talent ID, trying to rectify these kind of issues that come up in sport all the time. And yeah, so I started my master's in 2016, I think, and did a year. And then I started my PhD, which is about the effects of growth and maturity in youth football on talent identification and looking at coaches' evaluations and selection in a Premier League football club. So that's kind of what my thesis is about.
Okay, so I guess to start off with, if you could define kind of what growth and maturation is, and how that affects people, obviously, I guess puberty and stuff will come up, but how that has effects on children from the very young ages all the way through to, I guess, adult kind of stages.
Yeah, so obviously all children kind of go through growth and development as like their normal kind of pathway. And so growth is just like the increasing of size and structure of like limbs, general height, whereas maturity is more of like a process from being a child to becoming adulthood. So there's loads of things involved in maturity, skeletal maturity, sexual maturity, somatic maturity. So that's kind of more of a process rather than growth as just increasing linear height. And so I wanted to look at those two as independent processes on youth athletes. So how does growth, like literally increasing in size, affect athletes, and how does maturity, so all those different processes that are occurring at the same time, impact children? And the thing that's interesting with growth and maturity is it's genetic. So the players and athletes can't do anything about it. They can't change it. And yet it can have real implications on their like journey in sport.
Okay, so when we talk about the effects that it can have on sport and selection of sport and stuff, on a basic level, what would that look like?
Okay, so maturity, for example, so if you mature in advance of your peers, so you're going to be taller, stronger, faster, more powerful ahead of when your peers are going to achieve that. And so that's like a direct effect of maturation. So if you're an early maturer, you're more likely to be faster, stronger, you're going to be bigger, more powerful. Whereas a late maturer who hasn't had those physical advantages come through yet, because they're a little bit more behind developmentally, they're going to be a little bit smaller, weaker, slower, they're going to get pushed off the ball easy. So there's like a direct effect of maturation there, where early maturers are perceived as being better at sports sometimes than their late maturing peers.
And so how I guess how did you find that out? How did you go through the process of finding out that this took place?
Oh, so there's been years and years and years of research now showing that that's occurred in all sports where if you develop ahead of your peers, you're going to have these like advantages. So there's research out there, really good research out there that shows when these advantages occur. So is it before the growth spurt, after the growth spurt, in all sorts of different physical testing. So in sprint speeds, jumping, aerobic resistance, kind of all these kind of different physical testing. There's like a abundance of research that shows early maturers tend to outperform their later maturing peers. So my research kind of extends from that and tries to look at kind of different effects from that. So if we know they're stronger, more powerful, and bigger in football, my research tends to look at whether can the coaches perceive that. So the research that's been done before has tended to look at like 10-meter sprint, 20-meter sprint, GPS statistics. I wanted to know, can the coaches perceive that difference? So when they're watching the game, does their eye detect early maturers as outperforming the later maturers?
And so what did your research come back with?
So the first study in my PhD, I analysed the match grades of a number of players across 4 seasons. So we took their performance grade that was evaluated by their age group coach for every league game that they played in. And that was on a 1 to 4 scale. So we took those grades, and then we took their measure of maturity, which was percentage of predicted adult height, which is a method that there's loads of research on. It's called the Camis-Roach method. So we took their percentage of predicted adult height, and we looked at whether the coach could perceive differences between the most mature on the pitch and the least mature on the pitch. And we found that in most age groups, biological age significantly predicted match grades. So that means the more mature a player was, the higher their match grade the coach gave. And we found chronological age, which is known as like the relative age effect, where within a team, there's some people that are born earlier in the year and are older, and some people that are younger. We found that that didn't predict match grades. So it was more physical maturity. The more mature you were, the higher your match grade was going to be from your coach.
Okay, so I'm going to come back onto the match grading and all that type of stuff. Could you talk through the, I guess, kind of bio age or maturation age we discussed, and the chronological age and maturity stage, and what that looks like, along with I can't remember how you just phrased it, the percentage of predicted adult height. Could you talk through and kind of explain what those look like and how those calculations are done, etc.?
Yeah, so okay, so relative age is defined by a child's birthday within the year. So for example, each calendar year within school and sport has a year for cut-off dates. So for football, it's the same as school in England. It's September to August. And so if you're born in September, October, or November, you're a quarter 1. I'm born in April, so I'd be a quarter 3. And a lot of research out there shows that in sport, the quarter 1 born, so oldest within the age group, tend to be overrepresented. For a number of reasons. They've been alive on the planet longer. They are a little bit older. So they've got more skills, they've been doing things longer. So there's loads of reasons that can be. Relative age effect is different to biological maturity, however. So relative age is just your birth date within the calendar year. Biological maturity is the genetic component of when your body's going to start to mature, which is defined like 50 to 80% by genetics. So there's nothing a child can do about either of those things when they're born or their biological maturity. The percentage of predicted adult height is just a measure of biological age. So we take their current height and we work out their future height, their adult height, which has it's an estimation equation. It has some error associated with it depending on their age, but it tends to be about 2.2 centimeters accurate. And then we work out their current height as a percentage of their future height. And we know from loads of research that it tends to be around like 88 to 92% where their peak height velocity will occur. So that's where their biggest increase in height would be. And so we know that's like the during kind of growth age. And then you can work out where people are in their developmental pathway. Are they pre-growth spurt, during growth spurt, post-growth spurt? And also, if you have two players who are one's at 95% of their predicted adult height and one's at 85%, you know, this one is much closer to their adult status than this one. So if that makes sense.
Okay, so first question is how much more accurate does it get throughout the ages regarding their predicted adult height? And you know, how young down could you go to say this is roughly what their adult height is going to be? I know you've obviously said there it's between 2.2 centimeters error range, but how, as you go through the age groups and phases and stuff, how much more accurate does that get? And I guess the next question is, what effects does their developmental status have on their like physical output? So if they're pre like puberty or during puberty or after puberty, how much of an effect does that have on coordination, power output, all those kind of factors?
Yeah, so the equation you can go down, the research that's out there can go down as young as 4, and you can work out their predicted adult height from that data. The equation takes into account the child's age, child's height, and child's weight, and then it takes into account their parental mid height. So that's the mum and dad divided by 2. You churn all those numbers together, and it will spit you out a predicted adult height, and then we work out the child's percentage from that. And then your next question about the developmental pathway is, there's lots of research out there again, some really good research from the Cardiff group with Rodri Lloyd and John Oliver, that will have like developmental pathways, so what to train depending on where a child is within their growth spurt. There's lots of...
Could you talk through that?
Yeah.
If you could.
Yeah, so there's definitely better people to talk you through it than me, but there's loads of research out there about like youth athlete development plans and what to train, when to train, and that kind of looks at that peak height velocity that I was talking about, so the peak gain in height and weight, what's best to train around that. So is it speed, strength, power, and yeah, kind of what to target. I think what's most interesting is looking at the during the growth spurt stage. So that can be around like 86 to like 95%, where they're going to be in a real high stage of growth velocity. So per year, they're growing a lot of centimeters. That can kind of be where adolescent awkwardness kicks in, and they start to lose their coordination. There tends to be some dips in performance. And my second study of my PhD showed that we took those match grades in that I was talking about in the league games, and their coaches were evaluating them, and anyone in that during growth spurt category tended to perform lower than they did when they were in a pre-growth, and then when they came out of that growth spurt, their grade went back up again. So it kind of formed this nice V kind of graph, where during their growth spurt they were performing much lower than they were pre-growth spurt and post-growth spurt. So there's definitely definitely something in the during growth spurt stage where players tend to be losing coordination or strength, speed, power, because their body's going through this huge change in height and weight. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, so in terms of training players at that time, as you said there, that's a lot of areas that they could potentially have deficits in or be struggling with or whatnot. So what does the research suggest that you try and work with children on during that period, I guess, to have a level of progression, but also maintain the skills that they had prior to all these changes that their body's going through?
Yeah, so I mean, the research is constantly changing and constantly improving, and I think that probably the right answer would be we still are not 100% sure. There's a lot of research out there that in the growth stage, maybe we should be bringing the players back down to like fundamental movement skills and basics such as balance, agility, and also to kind of take the pressure off the training load, because a lot of players during that kind of growth spurt stage tend to come down with some growth related injuries. So there is some nice research out there suggesting that in that kind of growth spurt stage, we kind of wane back on the strength, speed, power training, and maybe go down to balance, footwork, and more coordination kind of skills, just to ease the players through that kind of stage. And then after they've come out of that, they'll be injury free, hopefully, because the training load will have been adjusted through that kind of growth stage. And then you can hit the training harder for strength, speed, power, post growth.
Perfect. And I know that obviously, having worked with lads that grow quite a lot, the growth stages and phases is where they can pick up a lot of those training injuries. Kind of what do those look like in your experiences? And apart from just decreasing load and whatnot, is there anything else that people can do to assist players going through that?
So I think probably the main thing from speaking to a lot of coaches is like understanding. If you can understand where a player is within their developmental pathway, you can really help them through the journey better. So if we know a player is pre-growth spurt, we can expect these changes are still to come. So we can understand that maybe when he gets into his 14, 15-year age group, these difficulties in coordination are going to come. And maybe, as I say, with all children having a different journey and some developing early and some developing late, one coach is going to have a group of players that are all going to be very different. So they have a tough job in trying to manage a spectrum of players from early to late maturation, and that's in any age group. So I think for a coach, it's about understanding what each player is in their group. So are they early or late maturer? Are they going through growth or not? Because that way you can really individualize their training programs to better develop each player, but also remain injury free.
And I guess, as you said, managing a group there, that's where your challenges come in, because if you've got a early maturing Q1, so might be born first week of September, for example, and they're very early maturing compared to a very late maturing Q4 who might be, July, August time, the differences between those two people or children can be quite pronounced, I'm assuming.
Yeah, really big. So you can also measure maturation by looking at the skeletal hand wrist x-ray, which takes into account all the bones in the hand. There's a few different methods to do it. And you look at like their growth plates and the shape and size of the bones and the morphology of the bones. And there's some research out there to show that for two 9-year-old boys, biologically they were 6 years different. So two 9-year-old boys born a week apart had both had their x-ray taken, and one boy was 3 years younger than where he should have been, and the other boy was 3 years older than where he should have been. So you can imagine that on a football pitch, if you've got a group of 12-year-old players, the difference could be biologically 6 years between the oldest and the youngest player on the pitch. Relative age-wise, with the quarters, the maximum difference is only ever going to be 12 months because of the way we group the children in sports. So the oldest could be born on September the 1st. The youngest is only going to be born a year later on August the 31st. So that is a big difference in terms of relative age, but compare that to biological age, where the difference can be 6 years. That difference between the most mature and the least mature player can be quite substantial.
And I guess linking this back to something you mentioned earlier, that's why you at times could potentially see differences in match grades.
Yeah, exactly. So my third and final study of my PhD was a longitudinal mixed methods approach to trying to understand this kind of complex area. And so I interviewed some youth coaches, and we tracked the players longitudinally over the year, measured their growth rate, measured their performances, looked at their maturity. And then we 3 times a year spoke to the coaches about where their players were in their age group and how they were doing. And yeah, coaches have a really good perception of their players without having the data. They know that that player seems to be struggling, he seems to be doing this, he seems to be doing that. And there were some really interesting findings in that study where coaches could say, oh, well, I graded him this grade because he made so many mistakes, or he got pushed off the ball a lot, he didn't impact the game. And all of these can be directly related to maturation. So a late maturer, for example, who is small, a little bit weaker than the other players because he doesn't have the physical capability yet, a little bit slower because he also doesn't have the physicality yet. They're going to find it much harder to impact a game against players that are biologically so much further ahead than them, and coaches can perceive that, and so maybe grade them a little lower. Whereas you're early maturing on the pitch, you're taller, you're stronger, you're able to push people off the ball, hold your own in the game, maybe score goals, and have an impact on the game. Coaches can perceive that and therefore grade them a little bit higher. And so the findings of that study in my PhD, and the implications were more, if we know this and we can see that coaches can perceive differences and evaluate them differently, those evaluations have a certain impact on their selection procedures for the club. So if coaches are going into these selection meetings for which players are going to be signed to the next level, these grades are really important. And if coaches are grading late maturers lower, late maturers are going to have a much harder chance at getting to the next level of the academy.
And so when you're looking at that, obviously you're saying that coaches are able to perceive those differences and perceive how players are performing. Were there any recommendations about how you could counteract that?
Counteract how?
For example, if coaches are able to perceive that a Q1 early maturer is, able to cope with the physical demands, is able to be powerful, that type of stuff, and they also see that the Q4s maybe are struggling in that area, was there any recommendations on how they could make that grading more rigorous? Because obviously what we're essentially highlighting is that you've got one group of players that look particularly good because they might be that much older. Is there any way to kind of bridge that gap so the Q4s are almost getting a fairer shot?
Yeah, so I think my main recommendation would be education. I think if coaches are educated as to which players are in which kind of developmental group, and also what the implications of growth and maturity are, I think those biases will become a lot less pronounced. But also, I don't know whether the grading system does need to change. So the 1 to 4 performance grading system of how did that player perform on the pitch at that time, maybe the fact that there is a difference is a good thing, in that the coaches can perceive early maturers as stronger, more physically capable, because of their maturation and physicality. But I think when we're evaluating those grades, and we need to just put them into some sort of context. So this grade, this average grade of 2.5 for this player for this season is 2.5 because of all these things. So it's because he's a Q4, it's because he's a late maturer, it's because he's going through some growth and he's struggling with coordination. And then this player that's a 3.5, well, he is a Q1, he is an early maturer, he can impact games because of all these things. So I think we just need to put these grades into context. So we can't argue with the fact that early maturers physically dominate football games. The GPS data shows it. The coaches' evaluations show it. We've got physical testing data which shows early maturers outperform their late maturing peers. So there is a difference in their performance, but we just need to put that difference into context. So this is why these players may be performing lower. And it's not that they're less capable, it's just that they're developmentally behind their peers.
And I know you mentioned Sean Cummings earlier on, who's done a lot of work in this area. And one of the things he's brought up is kind of bio-banding as a principle. Do you just want to talk through kind of what that process is and how that's implemented, or maybe on a ground level?
Yeah, so he's my supervisor, Sean, and he's done some really good work in bio-banding across football and other sports as well. So basically, bio-banding is a different way of grouping youth players. So as I said earlier, traditionally we group youth players in the calendar age group, so September to August or January to December, depending on what the sport is. But the problem with that is you get these rigid cut-off dates of what year a child is in the age group. Bio-banding kind of scraps the age groups and takes away those cut-off dates, and you group the players according to their biological age instead. So again, we take this measurement of maturity, estimate percentage of predicted adult height, and then you take, say, the under 12s to under 16s, and you group the players in their percentage. So you create these bands of any player that falls between 80 and 85% will be in this group. Any player that falls between 86 and 90% will be in this group. And you make these bands, and these players then play together. So it kind of churns up the age groups. You don't play with your normal peers. You might be playing with players that are older than you, players that are younger than you. And you create a new team, and they play the same band, if that makes sense. So you create this band, and then you create two teams, and they will play each other in a game, or you can use it in training. And as I was saying earlier, this 6-year difference in biological age that can sometimes arise in a chronological age group. So in a 1-year age band, you get this big difference. What biobanding does is it squashes that biological age difference. So although the chronological age difference might be bigger because the birth dates are all mixed up, the biological age band will be much smaller. So it's a much fairer, even playing field on the pitch. So as a coach, when you're watching it, you can see that the players are much more aligned in terms of their physicality.
And have you
so there's no,
I've seen that in a practical setting.
Yeah, I've been to a few tournaments now and a few training sessions where it's been done. I went over to US Soccer to watch a biobanding tournament be done over there. And I've seen it in boys and girls now, and it does definitely diminish the big differences. So you don't get this David and Goliath kind of situation where there's a player that's 3 foot taller than everybody else, so much stronger, has a beard, has calf muscles and really broad shoulders, playing against somebody who hasn't even gone through their growth spurt yet. And so yeah, it just reduces the level of differences in that kind of maturation status. But what I think is nice about it is I've done some research with Amy Spencer, a psychologist in academy football, and we looked at like how biobanding works in general as a principle, because there's a lot of critics out there that will argue you're taking away some of the challenge for the players, you're taking away some of the normal aspects of sport that are normally occurring within natural games. And so I think actually if you look at biobanding as a training purpose rather than a new age format that's going to take over the world, I think if you look at it that way, it can actually really develop the players. So the late maturers that would end up moving to a younger kind of age category and playing with people that are a similar size to them. Yeah, the physical challenge has been taken away, but it gives them a chance to work on leadership skills or work on their technical and tactical, and they're able to show off a little bit more because the physicality is being reduced for them. And on the flip side, when you push those early maturers up to play with older boys who are of a similar biological maturity to them, it means they can't dominate the game, they can't push people off the ball, they really have to work on their technical and tactical skills to kind of keep up. So I think it has really good practice in training to kind of work on both of those things for both kind of spectrums of players.
And in terms of from a coach's perspective, because obviously you mentioned there's a grading system and whatnot, when you were at those events or at those games, how did it affect their perception of the players potentially? Yeah,
so I've spoken to coaches before, and coaches they'll watch their team. Obviously, their team of under 12s, under 13s will then be spread across multiple different age groups. So they might have to watch this band to see some of their players and this band to watch some of their other players. And I think what's really interesting is their late maturers coaches will say, oh, he thrived. He really found his place and he could impact the game. I've never seen him being able to impact the game like that. And that's because that physicality has been taken away. And then for the early maturers, sometimes that's the top player in the age group. They're the ones that's always scoring the goals, always dominating the game. When they're pushed up into a higher age bracket where they're matched with their peers, that player can sometimes struggle, and it's because they've never had this kind of physical challenge for them before. And so coaches kind of can then see them in a different light and think, oh, actually, he needs to work on this now because he never has to work on that in this age group because he can physically dominate. But when you get pushed up, you can kind of see weaknesses shown. So I think on the most part, the coaches I've spoken to have really enjoyed it. They found it useful to see their players in a different light. And another thing, I think the players, I've spoken to players about it as well. The players enjoy, it's a different game, it's a different format. They have to think differently, and the players quite enjoy that. They get to play with different players. I've spoken to players who've said they got to learn from the older age groups. So, they've never seen an under 14 play and they were able to play with an under 14 and learn from them. And I've seen late maturing players say, oh, I've never been the captain before, because they've always been the smallest, littlest in the team. Making them the captain in a lower band was a big deal for them. They really enjoyed it. So I don't think it should replace age group practices by any means, but I do think it has a benefit in like a training evaluative tool.
So obviously it seems like there's loads of positives there in terms of skills they're able to learn or social interactions they might not have had. When critics aren't so keen on it, what are the points that they push back with? What do they say why do they say it isn't a good idea or isn't worthwhile?
I've heard people say that you're diminishing the differences in size, but they're always going to be there. So the main argument would always be, well, Messi still made it. And yeah, that is a good argument. But I think most people will admit that Messi is quite a special character. And so he made it for like lots of reasons. But again, I think in general, there's I've done some research with an academy that shows the maturity bias and relative age bias within an academy. And the drop off of late maturers after under 14s was huge. There was no late maturers in the under 14s, 15s or 16s age group. And I think that's really important. We're missing out on a really big pool of players that are either being deselected from the sport for being late maturer and they don't impact the game, they can't keep up, or they're deselecting themselves out for those reasons. Which of that we don't know. But I think there's a big pool of players there that we're missing out on. So the critics that say, oh, the cream always rises to the top, like Messi still made it. I think, yes, some still will, but there's going to be a big percentage that we do lose out on because of it.
I'm going to show you a photo and I'll put this on social media and stuff on again, which I think is a brilliant representation of some of the stuff you're discussing around. These are two under 14s out in Spain. I think if you type it in on Google, Sevilla and Villarreal under 14s, it's a really good thing. But the differences between these two.
Yeah, I've seen that on Twitter.
Yeah. And I think it's a brilliant example of what you're saying of those two boys and the challenges that they face. I guess, you're looking at under 14s, under 15s, under 16s age group, and then getting more towards kind of youth phase and all that type of stuff. Has there been any precedent of late maturers having real success when those differences are evened out? So that picture we've got there, or when you go to under 16s, if we're saying the cream always rises to the crop, have we got any examples of where actually those really late maturers have done really well when they have eventually caught up?
Yeah, there's so many examples. There's professional examples where players have made it who were late maturing, and coaches also talk about it. There's late maturers within academies that are brilliant, technically, tactically really capable. There's some really good research out there that shows strength and physical testing data, so strength, speed, power. Late maturers eventually will catch up, and if not surpass their early maturing peers. So you just got to give them patience. They will catch up once they develop. And that's the same in technical and tactical proficiency. There's also data out there that shows, there's a research paper that shows late maturers and relative age late born players eventually earn the most money at Premier League status. And the argument is that they've had more challenges, more hurdles to climb. And so they've really developed as a player because of that. So it's kind of like the underdog hypothesis. They've always been like having to fight and battle, and so when they've got to the top, they've got all these abundance of skills because of it. But my argument would be, again, there's still such a big group of players that we're missing out on, and so yeah, a few did rise to the top, but it's of such a small percentage of players that have managed to remain within the system, if that makes sense. So the cream will only rise to the top if they manage to stay within an academy. But if they're being deselected out for these reasons, they're going to really struggle to get back into the system at a later date.
And how could you, how would you challenge that in a constructive way? How would you challenge that with academies or, the selection across different sports? How would you challenge them to try and increase the level of Q3, Q4s, late maturers, etc., in their environments?
I think there's probably numerous ways to do it. I think education, again, is a big one, making sure coaches and parents and players are really up to date with how growth and maturation can affect players and the coaches' experiences. Because if coaches are aware that their biases and perceptions are being changed directly because of a player's maturation, maybe they can counteract that in training. I also think, again, biobanding is a good idea, in that it gives coaches a different light to watch players in, to evaluate players in. It gives players the opportunity to learn new skills in a new environment and really develop. So I think that's a good thing. There's some relative age tournaments being conducted out and about across clubs, which is a similar premise to biobanding in that it mixes up the age groups, but they will say, you know, it'll be a Q4 tournament where all the players have to be born between June, July and August, to try and ensure that these players and clubs are coming through with these kind of players and not excluding them. And then I think there's some really nice things to take from other countries and other sports. There's the Futures program in like Europe and Belgium that have like a team underneath their first team for late maturers to come through at, which some famous Premier League players have come through, where at 13, 14, 15, they weren't ready, but they were kind of kept back in a Futures or a B team as such, if that's what you want to call it, where they were able to develop and come through the system. And then eventually when they did catch up, they were still within the system to play. I think the main problem is if the players are out of the system and excluded from the sport, it's really hard to get them back in. So if we can keep them within the sport and keep them playing and developing, eventually they will catch up and be able to compete.
Is that on a national level or is that on a team level? So would that be like the Belgium national team, or would that be like Anderlecht, for example?
I think it is run across nationally, as in multiple teams have that kind of B team Futures program that feeds within to the national team.
Oh, that's cool. That's a really good idea. And is there any common threads that you see of those late maturers? Is there any common skills that they learn at the time where maybe they are the underdog, or any techniques or tactical stuff that they learn because of like because of the nature of them being maybe physically weaker or slower, or that type of stuff?
Yeah, so my final study in my PhD talked to coaches about this, kind of how they experienced managing athletes that were growing and maturing. And that had some really good insights. So this is more from the coach's perspective rather than the player's perspective. But the coaches of early maturing players found that a lot of the time they did rely on their physicality. They did rely on being physically dominant and the quickest. And that was what helped them win games and compete. They tended to be the confident ones, the ones that would win you the games, that would lead the team. And on the other hand, for a lot of the late maturing players, the coaches would say things like, oh, he gets pushed off the ball really easily, but technically and tactically, he's very, very clever. Game intelligence, he's very clever, because he has to pick out the best person to pass to. He has to make decisions faster because he knows he's going to get beat man to man on the ground. He, you know, on a foot race, the late mature is not going to win. So they technically and tactically have to be better. Psychologically, the late matures are sometimes more resilient. The coaches say, you know, they face a lot of challenges every day, and so they tend to keep going and battling. Like one coach says, late matures are like terriers, and that they just keep going and going and going. Whereas a lot of the coaches for the early maturers sometimes said, you know, when he faces a challenge, he's not capable of getting over it. You know, if he's had a bad start to a game, that's it for the game. And they put that down to the fact that they don't face challenge very often, that they tend to always be succeeding because of their size and maturity. So there were some really interesting things. A lot of the late maturers were used to being the physically dominant ones, and so found it particularly challenging when the late maturers caught up.
And how can we help the early maturers? Because like you said there, if they're used to being more physically dominant, obviously they probably have more time on the planet, so able to practice more, all that type of stuff. How can we assist them? Because I guess it's just important. We want them to have those challenges or those rocky road experiences, so they do learn, you know, that failure is really important and that you can learn from failure and all that type of stuff. What type of processes could we put in place to assist them?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's really important for both the early maturers and the late maturers to be challenged equally. But within a normal games program, it does seem to be that the late maturing players are the ones that are challenged more. So the way to combat that would be push the early maturers up, make them play with the age group above more often if it's physically and psychologically suitable. So if a player can cope with that kind of pressure and challenge, and they're physically capable of playing in the age group above, maybe a few training sessions, a few games they play up. Biobanding, again, they're forced to learn a new environment because they're playing with more physically capable players. And I think even simple things such as in training, maybe putting more restrictive drills on them. So if they are going to stay within the age group, don't partner the earliest maturer with the latest maturer, because they're going to win every battle. They're going to find it really easy. So you maybe make more restrictive. So you partner the earliest maturer with the next earliest maturer to give them more challenge on a daily basis. And also you say, you can't score with your right foot today, because if that's what they always do and they're so capable of doing that, you score with your left foot today only, to kind of give them that extra dimension of they're going to have to keep thinking, keep working on different skills and drills and tactics on a daily basis, because that is what the late maturers are doing all the time. They're having to adapt to just survive. So the late maturers need to be, maybe restricted, extra challenge, add that different dimension in to keep their development going.
And are these effects and whatnot something you've seen across continents? Because I know, like, when, for example, when we go out to tournaments abroad, they often go January to December, and that can present a different set of challenges because all of a sudden you've gone from being maybe older than all the teams there, whereas if you take out all your Q1s, all of a sudden you're one of the youngest groups there. And I know that's something, we're speaking to a lot of English academies, that's something that's interesting when you go abroad, because you end up going from being, you might have a September player or a load of September players, to then none of them being allowed to play. So then you've got loads of September the other end, and then 9 months younger and all that type of stuff. Is it something that you've seen across continents and across Europe and whatnot?
Yeah, so generally coaches tend to say the same kind of thing. What's interesting about across countries, if they do change the calendar date, they tend to get the same problem. It's just a different one. So our cut-off date is September to August. So our Q4s would be June, July, August, and there tends to be less of them. They're definitely underrepresented in academy football in England. But in other countries, if their cut-off date is January to December, their October, November, December players, there tend to be a lot less of. So they have the same problem, it's just being changed. So there was a lot of research out there about, to get rid of the relative age effect, maybe we change the cut-off dates. But if you change the cut-off dates, you just get the same problem, but at a different time of year. So I think that's really interesting, in that that kind of relative age effect is so persistent, in that the older players will still tend to dominate no matter where they are. It's just wherever the cut-off date is kind of lends itself to that.
It just kind of happens regardless. And what are the effects of this on different sports? Because if you look at a sport like rugby, for example, if we go back to that 6-year differential that we spoke about earlier, in a contact sport such as that can be really challenging. So how does it change from sport to sport in terms of the effect that it might have?
Yeah, so my research has definitely dominated in football, but I've spoken to other researchers on my research group who do things in other sports. Rugby tends to have very, very few late maturers within the system, just because the sport doesn't lend itself to having late maturers for exactly what you said, the physical contact reasons. I think that the thing with football is it is quite an early specialisation sport, so we do tend to have the children coming in quite early. Rugby, from speaking to a few people, players can still join quite late, so the late maturers may get in at an older age, which appears less so in football. And then in other sports, it does depend on what the sport kind of allows. So as I say, like contact sports like rugby, for example, boxing, any kind of martial art kind of sport, they would be grouped in weight categories anyway. So that kind of big physical difference is taken away for safety reasons mainly. They wouldn't fight under 9s to under 9s. It would be whoever was in the same weight category. So that kind of makes that fairer. There's definitely relative age effects in other sports. We've seen it in tennis and swimming. So it is kind of like talent identification issue across numerous sports.
And I guess on a talent identification level, obviously this is really challenging for, you know, scouts if you're looking at people going out and watching, or selectors if you're looking at tennis or swimming and stuff like that, to go around and go, oh, I know that person's born September the 1st, or I know that person's August born. And that can be difficult to know where people are along their journey. How could we counteract this on a kind of grassroots basic level so that we try and even the playing fields more, so there's more of a spread out over an entire year?
Yeah, so there's things that can be done. So for like relative age effects, there's some really good research out there where they bibbed the players in order of age. So the oldest player that was born in September had a number 1 on his bib, and the youngest player had an 11. So that kind of visual cue for the coach throughout training in the game, he was always aware that, oh, that player's the youngest, that player's the oldest. So I think that's a really good idea, because it's a constant reminder. Because I appreciate with coaching, it's so hard. I'm a swimming coach and I forget all the time. It's so hard when you're in the process of coaching to try and keep that kind of mind process going of he's the oldest, he's the youngest, he's the most mature, he's growing. There's so many complex things happening all at one go. So I think that kind of visual cue is a really nice reminder that, you know, who's the oldest, who's the youngest, and you can do that for maturity as well. So work out who's the most mature to the least mature, and you can visually order them and kind of make a difference that way. Also, there's things like visual cues anyway. So in terms of maturity for football, a lot of the coaches say they use, like, you know, the earliest maturer has a beard. It's quite obvious that he's going to be the most maturing compared to the youngest maturing who's got no facial hair, really small, really slender. So there's visual cues that coaches can use to kind of work out where the players are in the spectrum. So I think that's really important. But again, I just think it's education. I think once everyone is on kind of like the same page in scouting and coaching, we can kind of make some progress in that, you know, players shouldn't be deselected or overlooked because of where their birth date falls or where they are in their maturity status. Because again, that's something that a player can't do anything about.
And how's this affected your coaching? How's this research affected the way you act?
Yeah, so as I say, like, as I've been talking to football coaches about like perceptions, biases, experiences, they're not a bad thing. You can't take those things away. We just have to make more educated decisions. So yeah, I'm a swimming teacher and a swimming coach. And yeah, the thing is, it's a bit different to football swimming. So swimming's a speed sport, so it's who's the first to the wall, who is going to win the medals, rather than in football where you can have, like, you know, a really technical, tactical player. And in a team game, swimming tends to be an individual sport, and it's who's the fastest to the wall. So again, the early maturers do still tend to dominate because they can thrash through the water, they're bigger, faster, stronger, they can get to the other side faster. But I think for me, it's all about technique. So, you know, if those late maturers can really refine their technique, you know, refine those skills, eventually they will catch up. So it's about keeping them in the sport for a lot longer. And again, reminding those early maturers that, you know, you are going to get caught. So keep going with your technique, keep going with learning those tumble turns, those dives to try and get those extra gains, because eventually at 17, 18, maturity is not going to matter anymore. So it's just such, like, growth and maturity stuff is going to affect such a small stage of an athlete's pathway, that I think it really matters to try and kind of remove those biases, because when they're an adult, no one's going to care if they were a late mature. It's if they're still there or not.
And would you frame it to your kids or the kids that you're working with or have seen? Do you think the framing of it as a coach is important?
Yeah, I think so. And I also think most kids are very aware anyway. Like, as I say, I was a swimmer who was the smallest on the pool side. I knew that. I was very aware that when I stood on the diving blocks ready to go in a race, that I was going to come out of the dive already behind, because the girls were much stronger and faster than me. So I think it's about, like, keeping their confidence up, keeping those late maturers interested. Because for a lot of late maturers in any sport, if they are struggling and they're getting beat a lot, you know, most competitive children don't don't enjoy losing. So it's about keeping their confidence, keeping them enjoying it and wanting to carry on participating, so that when they do come through, they're going to be able to compete. So yeah, I kind of frame it as, have patience, it will come, keep working hard, you'll get there. And the same for those early maturers, just because it's easy now doesn't mean it's always going to be easy. So keep working on your techniques, your drills to kind of remain competitive.
And have you seen any of this linked to, like, I know there's research going into what effect birth order or having siblings and stuff has. The classic example is Michael Jordan, for example. I think was the youngest of 3 brothers. He used to get beaten up in the backyard, and all of a sudden went through a growth spurt, and then was able to beat all of his brothers. Have you done any crossover between that and seen the effects that potentially what birth order can have in the resilience and the social skills and the physical development, etc.?
Yeah, so not like any hard research as such, like anecdotally talking to coaches and parents and stuff, yeah, but no like hard research. But again, I think most people I've got an older brother who kind of taught me to swim to some extent, and we're quite competitive, and I always wanted to beat him, and he was 4 years older, so I always had to strive to beat him. So I think there's lots of anecdotal stories that kind of can prove that across sport. But I think there's so many things that go into talent identification, and obviously growth, maturation, and relative age effect is just one of them. Birth order is one, where you live can even be one, access to sport, there's loads of things. So growth and maturation is not the be all and end all, but I think it's a really important part at these youth stages that we can kind of educate coaches and parents and the players to a certain extent to try and kind of better develop and improve the talent pathway. But yeah, I think the birth order stuff is so interesting. The effects that can have on like athlete development is so cool.
And if we're talking about like grade A, the best put in practice plan that you could produce or have to help this kind of growth and maturation stuff have the smallest amount of impact on development pathways and give everyone like a fair opportunity and stuff, what would that look like for you in a practical context?
That's a really hard question. One more thing from my PhD that I haven't touched upon is that it's really hard to do this in an elite environment, such as a Premier League academy. Players and coaches want to win games, and although an academy football and youth sport shouldn't necessarily be about winning as such all the time, obviously winning is an important part, but it should be about athlete development. I think that kind of elite environment and competitive environment just exacerbates these growth and maturity kind of effects. So for example, the late maturer that is smaller, slighter, struggling with strength, speed, power, maybe even going through their growth spurt when all their peers are through it and have got all these physical advantages, that player, from talking to coaches and the evidence I've got in my PhD, tends to sit on the bench because he's not going to impact the game, he's not going to help them win the game, so we're not going to play him. But that player's then not learning anything, he's not achieving anything, sat on the bench. And so I think the main thing that I would say to answer your question is again, education. I feel like I've said that a lot, but that player's not going to learn anything sat on the bench. And, he may come on for the last 10 minutes when the game's done and dusted. But how's that going to benefit them? And, big games, big gold standard games that are really important to the win. I understand that, but that player's then never going to have had that kind of cup final experience because they're never going to be on the pitch. And then eventually when they're 2021 and they've made it to pro because they've eventually come through and kind of persisted, they're not going to have had any experience at high pressure games, and they're not going to have learned those skills. So I think academy football and youth sport in general, the kind of competitive element takes away the development of the players. Does that make sense? And so I think the growth and maturity stuff, we know there's these physical differences in their capabilities, and we can see with all the research that's out there that the early maturers are faster, stronger, they're going to impact the game more. And so we keep playing them. But these late maturers are not going to get a fair share of development and learning and their chance to kind of shine if the competitive element is always at the forefront of the coaches and the clubs and the youth sport programs mind. So I think my main thing would be education, keeping the coaches and the players and the parents all on the same page, in that we're developing the players and we're getting them all capable of playing first league football, whether they're early maturers, late maturers, Q1s, Q4s, because that's the only way we can make sure they all make it.
I guess that's a challenge that isn't just kind of at academy level, that goes right the way down to grassroots, because if you've got a cup final and you're, if, say, for example, you're an under-12 team, you've got your cup final and you've got a choice between these two players, it's nature that people want to win. Yeah. And quite often, that kid will get left on the bench. It doesn't matter kind of what level of sport you play at.
Yeah.
I've got a bit of a hypothetical for you in terms of your research. If there was an academy who twisted everything on and went, you know what, we're going to really try and select Q3s and Q4s, and we appreciate that in the short term, this is going to provide a lot of challenges, and potentially we're not going to win a lot in terms of performance-wise and stuff. Long term, how do you think a group like that would develop? Do you think you'd need those Q1s, Q2s to give them a strenuous training environment? Or do you think the subjection to games, which is going to challenge them, would be enough for them to then develop and maybe equal out some of the disparity that we see at the moment?
I think that's a whole new research question that somebody should do. I think that, why not? There's probably data out there that shows the Q4s are better for playing against Q1s and learning against Q1s, and late maturers are better for playing with early maturers. And I understand that. But I think the problem with the current system in some ways is that it doesn't allow for the late maturers and the Q4s to stay within the system. So I think, an academy that kind of retained these late maturers, retained these Q4s, and they can still play against Q1 players in other teams maybe, and still play against early maturers. And equally, training programs like biobanding and the relative age kind of competitions kind of allow that kind of to take place anyway. So I think, why not? There's, Q4s have made it. It shows in the Premier League that there's loads of Q4s in there, loads of late maturers eventually make it. But at the youth level, when you look at descriptive statistics of what's within the youth academy level, there are not many Q4s or late maturers retained. And so there's definitely a loss of a big pool of players that we can't select from because they're just not in the game anymore. So an academy that will retain those kind of players and allow them to develop, give them that time and patience to get there, maybe they'll come through and kind of prove that, eventually it doesn't matter.
It might be interesting as well if you had that group who then played between age groups. So say, for example, you've got they're technically under 13s in terms of thing, but they're only 2 or 3 months older than the under 12s. So they actually play half their fixtures against under 13s, half their fixtures under 12s. It'd be interesting to see then what the disparity would be, because they might struggle a lot against the 13s, but do really well against the under 12s. And then you'd be like, okay, so maybe actually when you put them in an environment that's more equal, we're seeing that there's some really good bits from them.
Exactly. And we see that in biobanding. We see players. I've got a story about under 13 who was the latest maturer within the group and born the last day in August. So that's a pretty double whammy of negatives. He was the youngest chronologically by far and the youngest biologically by far, and struggled day to day in training, struggled in competitions. And when they put him in a biobanded tournament, he was playing with 12 and 11-year-olds because that's how biologically much younger he was. So he was the oldest in the group, and all the coaches kind of focused in on, well, he's the oldest now. But he was actually still biologically in the middle of the group because of how the group worked. And he was the oldest, but because he was born so late in August, he was only the oldest by a few days because most of the kids within the group were born in September. So he'd gone from being the youngest by months to being the oldest by a few days. So I think it's really important to kind of look at the context. And he played really, really well in this biobanding tournament. The coaches couldn't believe it. He shone. But again, it was, he is still the oldest, but he was only the oldest by a few days now, rather than being the youngest by a few months. But it definitely kind of turned a light on in some coaches' heads where they were like, oh, okay, he's not struggling as much as we thought he was, because when you play him in the right environment, he coped fine.
So it seems like the big thing you're preaching here is kind of education and people making themselves more educated on the matter, and then just consideration for individuals. Look at where they are in their development pathway, be it, are they really early maturers, are they really late maturers, what does their growth look like, and actually accepting that, if they're going through growth, there might be a few occasions where they fall over their own legs or they kick the ground or do a few air shots. But if we can help them work through that with the ball mastery type stuff and coordination type stuff, that you can get through that phase with some good gains and whatnot.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's perfect. I think it's just all context. I've been studying this area for 4 years now, and I'm by no means an expert. I think there's so much more to learn. The coaches I've worked with have been brilliant. I just think it's all about the context of the situation, learning what's best for each player, what each player needs at each kind of moment in their pathway. Because as you say, you can be early maturing and a Q1, but also be struggling with your growth spurt and, falling over, kicking the floor and struggling with injuries. So, even if on paper you're the oldest and the earliest and it seems to be easy, you can still be struggling with your growth spurt and things like that. And so I think there's so many factors and concepts to look at. So kind of just looking at the bigger picture, really, I think is the best answer.
Perfect. I'm going to disallow you from saying your supervisor on this last question. But apart from him, who's the most impressive person that you've worked with in this area, and why?
Okay, so Bob Molina is a researcher over in America. He's in Texas, and I met him at a tournament in US soccer, and he's produced numerous research papers on the kind of subject area more generally of growth and maturation in children, and narrowed down into kind of sport. And he's very, very educated, very clever, very nice to talk to, and had some really good insights into what he thought was best. So I'd say his papers are definitely worth looking up. And obviously I can't say my supervisor, but yeah.
No, for those who don't know, obviously Sean's a real forefront of a lot of this work and has done a lot of papers over the years, kind of been a big advocate of the bioban and stuff. And if people are interested in it, he's definitely one I'd recommend to go and have a look at the work he's done, and I'm sure you would as well.
Yeah, and the research group at Bath, there's numerous researchers coming out of it that have done work in other football clubs, in ballet and gymnastics and tennis. So it's not all just in football.
Perfect. Listen, Megan, I really appreciate your time, and I think obviously it's been very educational for a lot of us, and a lot of considerations to go and work with the children on, and just a great way to consider coaching. So thanks very much, and then catch up with you soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Sports Initiative podcast with me, Michael Wright. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at the Sports Initiative Podcast, and share this podcast with friends and family. I'll see you next week.